And welcome to the Capitol Report. I'm Steve Lance. At the 7th cabinet meeting of his second term, President Trump touting plunging crime numbers in Washington. In previewing a tough new step he says his administration has no choice but to take. NTD's Mari Otsu brings us more from the White House.
Anybody murders something in the Capitol, capital punishment.
President Trump is saying that his administration will seek the death penalty in homicide cases in D.C.
If somebody kills somebody in the Capitol, Washington, D.C., we're going to be seeking the death penalty.
The president, at his 7th cabinet meeting today, is calling this a very strong preventative measure that his administration has no choice but to implement in the Capitol, but that states will make their own decision. This comes as the White House is touting the results of the D.C. crime crackdown, announcing that carjackings are down 86%, homicides are down 60%, and that there have been 0 murders over the past 2 weeks.
So the line is that I'm a dictator, but I stop crime. So a lot of people say, if that's the case, I'd rather have a dictator. But I'm not a dictator. I just know how to stop crime.
President Trump says he is looking to send the National Guard to other cities like New York, Chicago, and Baltimore, but that he wants local officials to request his help. This has met with pushback from local officials, with Maryland Governor Wes Moore calling the deployment unconstitutional. But President Trump is saying that the governor praised him in a private conversation before going on television to criticize him publicly.
But I met this gentleman. I never met him before. Sir, you're doing a great job. You're doing an unbelievable job. Thank you very much. But then he goes on television and says, oh, Trump is a dictator.
Meanwhile, the president is calling for Harvard University to pay a $500 million settlement to restore its federal funding.
We want nothing less than $500 million from Harvard. Don't negotiate, Linda. They've been very bad.
This comes as the administration is seeking $1 billion from UCLA over campus anti-Semitism claims. Last month, the president secured multi-million-dollar settlements with Columbia and Brown universities. And earlier this month, President Trump signed a memo requiring universities to disclose admissions data on race. The Secretary of Education says that since negotiations with the Ivy Leagues began,
I have presidents of universities calling every single week. They want to sit down and talk to us about all of the steps that they are taking because they would like to not come under the same investigative program.
President Trump's Harvard comments come as the Ivy League has asked for a final decision before September 3. Reporting from the White House, Mari Otsu, NTD News.
Our own NTD White House correspondent, Iris Tao, was covering the cabinet meeting at the White House. During today's meeting, President Trump asked Iris to share the story of how when she was mugged in broad daylight right here in the nation's capital not too long ago.
You probably figured that he's going to pull the trigger because these are animals that don't know what the hell. They couldn't care less. The pulling the trigger to him is a very minor event, and I'm sure he's done it before. So how did you, and you did refuse to give it, which would probably, maybe somebody would say that was not the right decision, right? Right. But you refused, but I understand that. And then he hit you real hard. Yes. It's really amazing that you weren't shot. That was.
And we do have our own Iris Tao in studio with us right now to discuss both her experience as well as what transpired today at that cabinet meeting. Iris, walk us through sort of today's events. The president asked you about your experience. It's really quite amazing. You referenced the fact that you did not immediately give up your items, which we all thought when we heard about it. We were scared initially for your safety, but then did question that decision. Tell us what happened.
So first of all, to your point, I actually did tell the whole cabinet that my friends did call me crazy, and that's why they laughed actually at that moment, though you couldn't hear it. But it was after President Trump started his crackdown and then prompted me to write an op-ed published in the Epoch Times about my experience as a White House reporter around 2 years ago getting robbed at gunpoint, and the guy used the butt of his handgun to basically pistol whip me in the face before running away. And after my op-ed was published, the White House press secretary retweeted it and asked everyone to read it. And the president apparently has read it as well. And that's why today he brought up my story, which I really appreciate, because having had that experience, which left me and my family deeply traumatized, as I told the president today, even till this day, I don't dare to walk in the streets of DC at night alone. Still, I still Uber home, and it's caused a big change in perspective for me and my family. So, as I shared today with the whole room, I'm grateful actually for the opportunity to share my story, and hopefully it's going to shed light on more cases like these, victims not just in DC but across the country who have their stories untold or who have experienced something like this and are now hopeful to see real changes.
And to your point, this incident that took place with you is in a relatively lower crime. High crime is everywhere in D.C., but there are a lot of people whose stories aren't told or aren't addressed. You did ask the president today about how the long-term sustainability, once crime is brought down, what efforts will be put in place to make sure that it stays that way.
Right. So I asked the president, as a victim like myself, we are worried about long-term sustainability. And he called it a great question and told me that, one, they want to have the National Guard troops stay in D.C. for as long as they can, which is beyond 30 days. And if he needs, he says he would call for an extension of the national emergency, which would potentially allow for even longer period for them to stay. But beyond that, when I asked him what's the solution for not only months, but years to come, he did mention that right now they're putting a lot of the criminals in prison and also deporting a lot of the illegal aliens who are committing crimes. So he says that in part will hopefully prevent them from coming back into the streets and committing crimes. But also he says the administration is working very closely with the police department. And he says if they ever see a spike in crime again in D.C., they will immediately strengthen their presence and bring National Guard troops back in. And of course, there's also accountability. Today, we just heard the president seeking potential capital punishment for people who commit murder in D.C. And even for my case, fortunately, I didn't get shot. The guy pistol at me but didn't open fire. But he even asked the Attorney General Pam Bondi to actually look into my own specific case to find the person. And here's what he told the room. Let's take a look.
Did they ever capture these people, by the way?
I kept calling, but I haven't heard back about this guy.
It'd be really great if you could maybe give the information. She's very good at capturing people, you know? She's very good. If you could give that information to Pam, would be great. Would you do that?
Yes.
Wouldn't you'd love to see them? I would assume you'd like to see them captured.
For sure.
You can't. You just can't.
For years.
Yeah, take a good look at that.
So whoever robbed me, if you're watching TV, be careful.
Well, I'm sure you'd love to see a resolution to your case. I know we would. NTD's Iris Tao, please stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you more frequently at the White House.
Thank you.
And the Trump administration is now appealing to revive a lawsuit against all 15 federal judges in the state of Maryland. The case has implications for immigration and judges' power across the nation. First, Maryland's Chief Justice blocking immediate deportations for any illegal immigrants who are challenging their removals. The Trump administration then suing, saying that this will interfere with its authority to enforce the nation's immigration laws. But just today, Virginia federal judge Thomas Cullen dismissed that lawsuit, saying the administration could appeal any one of the individual immigrant cases or file a complaint, but not sue the entire judiciary. For now, immediate deportations will remain blocked, and immigrants will have 2 days to have their petitions reviewed. And in the 39-page ruling, Judge Thomas Cullen, who was appointed by President Trump, had harsh words for the administration's litigation path. Joining me now to assess is former Trump attorney and former federal prosecutor Jim Trusty. Jim, great to have you on with us.
Sure, good to see you.
Jim, the Department of Justice was trying to sue all 15 federal judges in the state of Maryland, but a judge just tossed this whole case out. Essentially, the DOJ wants to limit a judge's ability to stall these types of immigration cases. What implication does today's decision have for deportation cases and really, quite frankly, judicial power in general?
Yeah, I don't think it's anything gigantic. I mean, that's kind of the good news for the administration. I mean, this is a judge who used to be the U.S. attorney appointed by President Trump down in Roanoke. for the Western District of Virginia. He does have some orneriness in this opinion, which we can talk about. But the bottom line is he says, like, look, if you want to challenge what's happening on an individual case, you can do that, Mr. Federal Government. You can either challenge the habeas proceedings that are taking place or go up to the Fourth Circuit on appeal from Maryland and fight what you want to fight there. You can even change the local rules if you want to, but you're not in a position to just have a blanket injunction over judges because the judges, among other things, have sovereign immunity and they're acting in their official capacity when they announce this 2-day rule. Again, this is a rule that's only applying to people that have a pending habeas petition. And probably what your viewers ought to know is that most habeas corpus petitions in the district courts across this country, with some spirited exceptions, fall flat. There's not a lot of relief that's given to people that are ordered removed by the district courts. The problem is the volume has picked up. There's a lot of these petitions flying around. And what Judge Hazel wanted to do in Maryland was say, look, at least don't take them out of our jurisdiction during the first couple of days. Let us look at their petition and most likely deny most of them before you move them to another state. Because every time they move an illegal alien to a different facility out of state, the original court loses jurisdiction over the habeas. So it's kind of preventing a shell game. That's what Judge Hazel wanted to do with that ruling. The court came down hard against the federal government having any sort of basis for a lawsuit or jurisdiction over the suit, came down hard on sovereign immunity as protecting these judges. But in the real game of life, I don't think this is going to have a massive effect on the speed at which the government can get people deported.
And Jim, to your point with regard to the judge's opinion in this case, who was actually, we'll remind the audience, was appointed by the president previously, he said that the Trump administration is trying to damage the reputation of the justice system. Do you think that the administration's criticisms are valid? And what do you think is the risk to taking it too far?
Well, you know, as a lawyer who's been in the criminal justice system for 35 years, I was a prosecutor for 27. We're kind of trained to be very circumspect about criticizing judges. You know, we respect the robe, even if we don't necessarily respect the person. So I'm not one that's quick to like jump on the bandwagon of completely trashing judges. That said, there's been an extraordinary amount of lawfare, an extraordinary amount of willingness of judges to go out on a limb when President Trump is one of the parties to hurt him. So the frustration with activist judges with nationwide injunctions is something I completely understand. So yeah, this judge came off, I think Judge Cullen came off maybe a little thin-skinned, talking about how, you know, this is a kind of an unnecessary confrontational move by the executive branch. And then he has a footnote using all those kind of descriptive terms that have been thrown at judges across the country. But I think in some instances, maybe it's overblown, but in a lot of instances, it's fair to criticize his judges for being activists at the expense of President Trump.
Now, Jim, it's no secret Washington, D.C. votes over 90%, at least in the presidential, for the Democratic candidate. President Trump now announcing today that he's seeking the death penalty for murders in Washington, not something that you typically see in what you would call a blue state, calling it capital punishment. First of all, legally, do you think that this will be able to be put into practice? And if so, just how big of an announcement is this today?
Well, I think it's a big announcement because of the messaging in general. You know, it's telling people that these traditionally blue cities that have been plagued for many years with violent crime have a new sheriff in town. And so I think that message may resonate beyond political parties. I think there's people that live in the shadow of fear, that go through things like Iris went through, that are welcoming a more aggressive federal government. Now, I assume when you're talking about the death penalty, and I haven't read through the executive order, but I assume what he's talking about is in federal cases as opposed to superior court cases, because DC has both kind of the local component and the pure federal component. And look, on the federal cases, the U.S. government has a lot of discretion. They have a process they go through. If they want to view DC as something that's kind of inherently vulnerable, inherently important to send the right message about pursuing the highest level of accountability, then they're going to be in a position to do that. I don't think you're going to see dozens or hundreds of cases that are suddenly death penalty cases out of DC, but it could certainly make a difference for people like the guy who murdered two Israeli embassy personnel who had the temerity of going to the Israeli museum. So, there are cases where that's telling you, if you're part of the community, if you're a defense attorney, for instance, that if it happens in D.C., you're facing a new sheriff.
Speaking of a new sheriff, we're seeing it in D.C. There's talk now of sending federal troops, and in particular the National Guard, to other cities. How do you see this playing out? Will it be challenged legally? And what case can the administration make to defend it?
Yeah, I think it will be challenged. I mean, we've got a taste of this in California when the president had the National Guard roll out to shut down some of the protests that were happening in LA. And of course, Gavin Newsom says, we don't need any help from you. And eventually the protests did, in fact, fizzle out and the National Guard returned home. So even though DC is different because of the home charter rule, I think there is an ability to activate the National Guard when he declares emergencies in these situations. The devil's in the details, Steve. I mean, the reality is, if the National Guard is out there to just create a deterrent effect by standing in front of Union Station, for instance, that's kind of unassailably helpful. And I think that's something we see a lot of in DC over the last couple of weeks. If they are also backfilling, and this is what the president mentioned the other day, or Tom Holman mentioned, if they're basically going in to help federal resources free up from the desk, from the detention center, and get out on the streets. In other words, National Guard does the processing, agents get out on the street and make the arrest. That's a force multiplier. And I've lived and breathed when I was a prosecutor doing gang cases, where it was always the right technique to have a task force, to have federal agents working with local police, to have kind of that marriage of skills and resources to bring the best cases, to bring violent crime to heel. So I think that, despite all the political wailing from places like Chicago and Baltimore, that at the end of the day, a lot of the rank and file people that live there would love to have more of a distinct federal presence to both deter and then ultimately prosecute some of the worst of the worst.
To your point, the president in the cabinet meeting today referencing some of the black folks in Chicago wearing red MAGA caps and embracing that in a city that's really been plagued with so much crime over the past decades, really. Just lastly, Jim, in your assessment, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the Salvadoran national who has picked up a lot of headlines, do you think that he'll ultimately be deported again? They were trying to send him back to Uganda, and legally, that's not back where not where he's from, but legally, where does this case stand in your opinion?
Yeah, good question. I mean, look, the win that the defense had with him in the early days of his immigration travels was to forbid him from being sent to El Salvador because he's an MS-13 member, that he faced some sort of retaliation if he returned. So it's kind of ironic to have ACLU lawyers saying, how dare you call him a gang member? How dare you send him to El Salvador, when they're the ones that set up that regime with the immigration court for him to avoid going to that one particular country. When a home country won't take somebody, you don't get to say, well, I'll take my pick of either the French Riviera or somewhere in the Caribbean. They're going to send you where they're going to send you. I think that day will come for him eventually. I actually have to tell you, I kind of hope that the case in Tennessee that was indicted for human smuggling is a real case, and that they let that case play out, even though that means he's on the streets for a while, but because of the Tennessee judge ruling that he's not a danger to the community or a risk of flight. I think you let that case play out to show that it was a real indictment, get the conviction if you're going to get it, and then let him serve a sentence before he gets removed. I think that's the most appropriate way to play it if that's a real case. And a lot of the defense attorneys out there are saying, oh, the indictment was just a mask to try to get him locked up again. It's not a real case. I'd like to see, indictments be real indictments. And if that's the case, that they let him go through the process and hurry up and try the case, rather than worrying about removal to Uganda right this minute.
Jim Trusty, appreciate you joining us to share your insights.